In the early years of the 19th century, Ireland stood cloaked in green, its fields lush with promise, and its villages pulsing with the humble rhythms of rural life. Generations of families depended almost entirely on the potato, a crop that thrived in their poor soil and yielded enough to feed both the peasant and his child. Each morning began with the sound of hooves on muddy paths, the smell of earth wet from dew, and the hope that the ground would once again offer its gift. But beneath this idyllic surface loomed an imbalance of power, a simmering tension that stretched back. Centuries Ireland was governed by England, but its people were governed by hunger. The landlords, many of them absentee and living lavish lives across the sea, owned vast estates worked by tenants who paid rent in labor or coin, while barely scraping by themselves. The landlords were protected by law, by army, by empire, while the Irish peasantry was shielded only by their faith and fragile crops. Then, in the year 1845, disaster took root in the very soil that once sustained them. The potato blight, known as Phytophthora infestans, arrived like a silent thief, sweeping through the countryside, turning firm tubers into foul mush and leaving behind nothing but rot. The first signs were ignored, dismissed as a bad season, a freak disease. But as weeks turned to months and the blackened leaves spread, despair gripped the land. The blight returned the following year, then again and again. Each time it came, it struck harder than before. Houses once filled with the scent of boiling potatoes now stank of sickness and starvation. The children cried with bellies bloated not from food but from emptiness. Mothers clawed at the earth. In desperation, fathers stood helpless, watching their families wither. Yet what made this famine not just an Irish tragedy, but an English one, was not the crop failure alone. It was the failure of policy, the cruelty of indifference. London saw Ireland as a burden, not a neighbor. Appeals for aid were met with bureaucracy and lectures about self-reliance. Relief programs, when they came, were meager, delayed, and often tied to impossible conditions. Workhouses overflowed with the weak and the dying. Soup kitchens ran dry. Rigid economic philosophy dictated that market forces should prevail, that intervention was dangerous, that charity encouraged laziness. So while Ireland starved, its grain and livestock were exported under armed guard to English markets. While families perished in muddy cabins, barrels of butter and crates of meat left Irish ports, bound for a country that ruled with distant apathy. In this first wave of horror, Ireland began to unravel entire villages. Emptied families disappeared into mass graves or onto coffin ships bound for the Americas in hopes of survival. But what they left behind was more than land or livestock. They left behind a legacy of betrayal, a wound that would bleed through history and echo far beyond the shores of the British Isles. As the famine deepened, its horror took new forms, not just in the fields where the soil yielded no food, but on the sea where desperation drove thousands to escape a land that had turned hostile. Coffin ships, they were, called vessels overloaded with starving souls who sold what little they had for a one-way ticket to the New World. They were packed with families shivering in the cold belly of the ship, pressed together like cargo beneath rotting beams and leaking. Hull's disease ran rampant, dysentery, cholera, and typhus killing hundreds before the ships even reached open waters. For many, the ocean became their grave, marked by no stone, remembered only in the cries that echoed briefly before the waves swallowed them. Among the survivors were children, made orphans in transit, women who gave birth amid storms, and men who arrived with nothing but skin over bone. These were the lucky ones, for those who stayed in Ireland faced a fate just as grim. Back home, the famine had turned villages into ghost towns. Fields once full of green were now gray with ash, where cabins had been burned by landlords evicting tenants who could no longer pay their rent. Entire families were forced out, left to die by the roadside or seek shelter in overcrowded workhouses where disease finished what hunger had started. The workhouses were meant as places of last resort, yet they became warehouses of suffering. Children were separated from parents, men from wives, all forced into hard labor in exchange for a few meager spoonfuls of gruel. The stench of death lingered in every corridor, and yet these places remained full, because outside there was nothing but frost, mud, and silence. Churches rang their bells over. Empty pews, schoolrooms sat vacant, and markets once bustling with trade had become places where people sold their last possessions for a bite to eat. The British government continued to respond with heartless logic. Parliament debated over statistics. While mothers buried children in unmarked graves, prime ministers wrote letters of regret, while priests offered last rites to entire families. In a single evening, the land itself began to protest. Cattle wandered aimlessly. Crops refused to grow. Rain came too late or too hard, and always the blight returned like a curse that no prayer could lift. The blame grew heavy, and it was directed squarely at the English, whose policies of non-intervention became symbols of cruelty. Free market ideology was worshipped more than human life. Laissez-faire economic theory meant letting people die rather than disrupting trade, and the people of Ireland knew it. They knew that help had been possible, but withheld. They saw the ships full of food guarded by soldiers leaving their shores, and they remembered they would never forget. The famine created a new kind of Irish identity, one rooted in loss and rage and determination. It turned priests into rebels, poets into chroniclers of grief, mothers into legends of endurance and suffering. Children who survived grew up with stories of hunger embedded in their bones, and those who left Ireland carried their pain into the streets of New York, Boston, Montreal, and Sydney. They built new lives, yes, but they built them with memories of injustice, and songs sung in mourning Irish immigrants became the backbone of labor movements, political revolutions, and cultural resilience. Their tragedies turned into fuel, and their sorrow into stories passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation. In England, few cared to look back or accept blame. Politicians spoke of lessons learned while distancing themselves from the consequences. Newspapers printed pieces of sympathy, but rarely admitted guilt. The Irish famine became a footnote in British history, but a defining chapter in Irish memory. In the wake of so much death and abandonment, something else began to rise, a sense of resistance that would shape the future of Irish politics: nationalism. Once a quiet undercurrent began to roar. The famine taught the Irish that they could not depend on the British crown, that their survival required sovereignty, that their voices needed not just to be heard, but to be freed. It was not just about food. Anymore, it was about dignity, self-rule, and remembrance. The scars left by the famine would never fully heal, but they would harden into resolve. The suffering became sacred, the dead honored not just in gravestones, but in the very spirit of a nation being reborn. In taverns and churches and schoolhouses across the Irish diaspora, stories of the Great Hunger were shared like sacred scripture. They did not speak of famine as natural disaster, but as a man-made tragedy inflicted by policy prejudice and power. The term genocide began to appear on angry lips and in whispered prayers. There were those who called it a crime against humanity before such a term even existed, and they were not wrong. For when you deny food to the starving, when you protect commerce over children, when you evict the dying from their homes, when you silence their pleas with doctrine, you are not simply failing to help. You are choosing their death. Over 1 million Irish souls died during those years, and more than 2 million fled. The island would never be the same. The landscape changed, but so too did its heart. Ireland began to awaken from centuries of silence, driven by the memory of suffering and a longing for justice. What had been a story of survival was becoming a rallying cry, a reason to rise, a chapter that would echo in every future fight for Irish freedom and dignity. Across the Atlantic, in crowded tenements and labor camps, the memory of the Irish famine was alive in every cough, every cracked hand, every restless night in a foreign bed. The immigrants who arrived on American shores were not merely poor. They were marked by loss. They carried more than luggage. They carried the silence of the dead, the weight of homes left behind, and the bitter knowledge that they had been forsaken by those meant to protect them. In cities like New York and Boston, they were met with suspicion, hatred, and doors slammed in their faces. No Irish need. Apply signs hung in shop windows as if their tragedy followed them like a curse. Yet despite the scorn, they toiled, built, laid tracks, hoisted steel, taught their children to read, and slowly turned their grief into grit. Every Irish enclave became a fortress of shared pain and resilience, and in these tight communities, the story of the famine was told again and again, not to weep, but to remember. Their pain became political fuel. They joined unions, demanded wages, ran for office, and wrote songs that turned their sorrow into strength. They brought with them a radical awareness of injustice, a fire that could not be extinguished by bigotry or labor or time. In Canada, many found less hostility, but the cold was harsher, the land more rugged, and the isolation profound. They built farms, and churches, schools, and communities that bore the names of lost Irish villages. Their faith was their anchor, and their history, their map. Each St. Patrick's Day was not just a celebration of Irish culture, it was a tribute to endurance to those who had died in the fields, and on the ships, and in the workhouses they never forgot. And then there were those who reached Australia, banished or brave enough to venture to the other side of the world, a land so different and yet strangely familiar, with its wide sky and ancient soil. Here, too, they carved lives from hardship, many arriving as convicts or settlers driven by hunger and hope. They became part of a growing nation, but always with their eyes turned west toward the land that had betrayed them. Back in Ireland, the famine had not just decimated a population, it had shifted the fabric of society. Those who survived became wary of power, suspicious of promises, and deeply connected to the land and to each other. The Catholic Church grew, in influence filling the vacuum left by broken government. A new cultural identity emerged, forged not in prosperity, but in shared trauma. Gaelic language, preservation music, and poetry began to bloom as a way of reclaiming what had been nearly erased. The hunger had not only emptied stomachs, it had nearly erased a culture, but the survivors would not let that happen. They built monuments, wrote names where there had been none, and kept diaries, past stories, and etched the faces of the lost into memory. This was not just an effort to mourn, it was an act of rebellion, a refusal to let the English version of history stand unchallenged. And in England, the truth was slowly catching up. The cries from across the sea, the articles, the memoirs, the growing unrest among the Irish diaspora began to seep into the British conscience. Some writers, politicians, and thinkers began to question. The Empire began to admit that what had happened was not mere misfortune, but negligence, at best cruelty. At worst, the famine had exposed the moral rot at the heart of British imperial policy. The belief that some lives were worth less, that profit could justify pain, that distance excused responsibility, and this realization rippled outward, in India, in Africa, in other colonies. People looked at Ireland and saw a mirror. They saw how the empire treated those it deemed lesser, and they began to question how long they would remain silent too. The famine became a quiet global reckoning, a signal that the sun might never set on the British Empire, but its shadow was full of ghosts. For Ireland, it was a slow road to recovery, physically, emotionally, and politically. The soil eventually healed, though never fully. The scars of mass graves remain, visible in the fields where children once played, in the homes where families once prayed. The country mourned not just for the dead, but for what they might have become: doctors, poets, parents, revolutionaries. And yet, amidst the mourning, there was movement. The seeds of independence were planted in the very soil where potatoes had failed. The famine had shattered the illusion of benevolent rule, and in its place it birthed a fierce, unyielding demand for self-determination, one born not out of politics, but pain not out of ideology, but survival, not out of ambition, but memory. The famine had changed the Irish people forever, and in doing so, it had changed the world. As the decades passed, the echoes of the famine did not fade, they fermented. into something potent and unstoppable. In the hearts of those who remained, and the millions who scattered across the globe, the famine became more than memory. It became identity. Every stone wall built by Irish hands, every hymn sung at a family, wake every whispered tale passed from grandparent to child, carried the grief of those terrible years. The famine was not over. It lived on in the decisions, the fears, the resilience of an entire people. In Ireland itself, the land struggled to recover, not just in fertility, but in spirit. The country was quieter now. Fields left fallow cottages overgrown and entire counties depopulated by death and emigration. The rhythm of life was slower, haunted by loss and caution. Yet within that silence, a new consciousness stirred, one rooted in the belief that never again should an outside power decide who would eat and who would starve. The famine had taught the Irish that their future must be their own. Movements for home rule gathered momentum. As political leaders rose not from nobility, but from the ranks of those who had suffered, priests, school teachers, and poets stepped into the public sphere armed with stories, not swords, and demanded recognition of a nation betrayed. Literature, too, became a weapon. Writings of the time carried the weight of a people wronged. The works of James Clarence Mangan and John Mitchell did not just chronicle the famine, they indicted those responsible. They turned pain into poetry and injustice into resistance. And still the church grew its role in everyday life, expanding as priests became not just spiritual guides, but political voices, shepherds of faith and fury. The Irish language, which had nearly disappeared during the famine, began to return. Spoken softly at first, then proudly taught in schools carved into stone and sung from pulpits. It was not just language, it was rebellion, a way of reclaiming what English policies had tried to erase. Across the sea, the diaspora flourished Irish. Americans rose to power in unions, politics, and journalism. Irish Canadians helped shape the new dominion. Irish Australians became part of a changing continent. Yet in every one of them was the famine, like a scar beneath the skin. Their successes were not in spite of that history, but because of it. Their determination was hardened in the fires of loss, and it shaped the countries they now called home. Many sent money back to Ireland, built churches, donated to schools, and supported causes. For independence, thousands returned not to live but to fight during later rebellions and uprisings, their hearts still tied to the land of their ancestors. By the late 19th century, the famine had already begun to transform into something. Even larger than memory, it had become myth, not in the sense of fiction, but in the sense of sacred truth. The famine was now a symbol of Irish endurance, of the cruelty of colonialism, and the unbreakable bond between suffering and identity. It featured, in songs, laments, murals, and the solemn quiet of annual commemorations. Every child who asked what happened was told not just about the blight, but about the betrayal, about the ships of food guarded by soldiers, about the mothers who died cradling their babies, about the young who boarded coffin ships and never returned, and they were told never to forget. In London, the legacy was more muted, discussed in Parliament and journals, but rarely confronted in public. Britain had its own narrative. Of empire, one of progress and civilization, and the famine did not fit easily within it. It was easier to speak of miscalculation than of malice, to frame the famine as a sad inevitability rather than a consequence of greed and governance. But history is not written only by governments. It is carried in bones and blood and breath, and the Irish carried it everywhere they went. In time, the famine came to be recognized not just as a tragedy, but as a turning point, one that reshaped Ireland from a subjugated land to a people awakening to their power. As the 20th century approached, that awakening would turn into action and the long journey toward independence would find its roots in the hunger that once silenced the island. For hunger had taught the Irish many things, but the greatest of all was this, that survival is not submission, that to live is not enough unless one can live with dignity. and that justice delayed may never come unless it is demanded with voices loud enough to shake the very empire that once watched them die. As the 20th century dawned, Ireland stood on the edge of transformation, and the famine remained at the center of its national soul. It was not just a memory, it was a force shaping every conversation, every rebellion, every vote cast for freedom. In the rural hills and urban streets alike, there lingered a fierce pride in survival, a sacred responsibility to honor the dead not by silence, but by action. The Easter Rising of 1916 was not merely a revolt against British rule. It was a revolt rooted in the belief that Ireland would never again be starved into submission. Many of those who took up arms or raised their voices did so with the ghosts of famine, victims beside them. The hunger that had once weakened the Irish now steeled them. It gave them cause, memory, and unity. The famine survivors had raised children who became the revolutionaries, poets, teachers, and lawmakers of a new era. The British response to the Rising, like its response to the famine, was cold and swift. But this time it did not break the spirit of the Irish. It hardened it. The violence that followed, the executions, the imprisonments, the suppression only deepened the determination for independence. In the years that followed the War of Independence, and then the Civil War tore through the island, but always underneath the battles was the whisper of the famine. That old lesson that self-rule was not just a political aim, but a moral imperative. The establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922 was more than a geopolitical event. It was a spiritual reckoning, an answer to a century of loss and betrayal. Yet even with independence, the famine did not leave its people. It lived on in the empty towns, the abandoned cottages, the songs sung in sorrow and pride. It shaped how Irish people saw authority, charity, religion, and justice. It influenced policies of social welfare. It informed debates about neutrality in global wars. It haunted agricultural practices and migration patterns. It even found its way into Irish literature, cinema, and music as a symbol of both pain and perseverance. In the diaspora, the famine continued to inspire not just remembrance, but activism. Irish Americans supported civil rights movements. Irish Canadians stood with labor unions. Irish Australians marched for justice, and everywhere the story of the famine was told. It sparked solidarity with others who had suffered under imperialism. The famine became a bridge connecting Ireland's past to the world's present, a story that transcended borders and became part of a global legacy of resistance and survival. In academic circles, the narrative began to shift from a sad natural disaster to a case study in colonial mismanagement and ethnic discrimination. Scholars uncovered documents, letters, diaries, and trade records that painted a damning picture of deliberate negligence of economic policies weaponized against the poor, of decisions made not in ignorance, but in apathy. That re-examination added weight to calls for formal apologies, for reparations, for justice long overdue. Some progress was made. Memorials were built both in Ireland and abroad. Museums were funded, curriculums, updated official acknowledgments made. But for many, no apology could ever be enough for the million lives lost, for the million dreams drowned at sea, for the culture nearly extinguished. The famine had become a fire that forged Irish resilience and reshaped global perspectives on hunger, colonialism, and accountability. It taught that food is never just food, that politics and policy can kill as surely as war, and that the silence of the powerful is as dangerous as the sword today, as the world faces new hunger crises, climate disasters, refugee waves, and power imbalances. The lessons of the Irish famine ring louder than ever. The story of a small island, ignored in its time of need, has become a warning, a call to conscience, a reminder that history, forgotten, is tragedy, repeated. And yet the Irish did more than survive. They rose. They danced where graves once were. They sang where silence had reigned. They spoke truth where once only prayer had dared go. They built a nation not just of laws and land, but of memory and meaning. They proved that even in the face of great cruelty, a people can endure, adapt, and inspire change that ripples far beyond their borders. The Irish Famine was an English tragedy, yes, but it was also an Irish awakening and a global inheritance of grief and strength. And if there is any justice in remembering, it is that the world now knows this truth and carries it forward, so that such suffering never happens again, not in silence, not in shadows, and not without a fight for every life that still hungers for dignity, freedom, and remembrance.